Hello, and welcome here to Varmblog's Radical Engagement. And today we're talking about a short piece by Ian Welsh, political blogger, general doom predictor, and guy I kind of like but don't always agree with. Ian Welsh recently wrote a brief little post about the Western university system that is interesting, and I wanted to comment on it. I am commenting at the end of September. This will probably come out almost in November because that's how the schedule works. If you guys haven't figured out that I record way ahead, now you know. But nonetheless, let's get into this a little bit. All right, I make this bigger so people can read it as I follow along. All right, this is The Rise and Fall of Higher Education in the Medieval University Crisis by Ian Welsh. This is mainly based on one book, The Crisis and Decline in the Credential System, found in Sociology since mid-century, Randall College, 1981. I have not read this, but let's get into the assertions here. We are currently in the late middle stage of a higher education crisis in the West. And I find this interesting because I knew we were in a late middle stage of a higher education crisis in America. So, for example, I'm a high school teacher, and I've seen dwindling interest, particularly among boys, but just in general, of people going to college. They don't feel like it's for them. They feel like the cost is too high for what they get, and the outcomes are too unstable, and they'd rather go into trades. Now, there are problems with this. Trades aren't recession resistant. There seems to be an assumption that there will be no recessions in the future, but universities have not done themselves well in this regard. And popular opinion polls, even amongst liberals who used to be elite university worshipers, have pretty much turned against the Ivy League almost 100%. It's pretty startling. If you think about the attacks on Bush for being a faux Yale grad versus Obama being a Harvard grad, you don't hear that about Tim Walz, and no one brings it up about Kamala Harris. The fascination with the Ivy League with both parties seems to be pretty much over. Add to that the various crises of respectability and the way a lot of the elite schools have pivoted wildly and authoritarianly, both for backing up activism in 2020 and then suppressing it in 2023 and 2024. None of that's been really good for the university system, and that's not even dealing with the obvious, which is birth rates are declining, and the replacement rate in America was maintained by immigration, which has been downplayed since 2017, 2018. All right. This isn't a worldwide crisis. The Chinese system is still in the expansion phase, but it's very real here. I might actually disagree with Welsh on that, just because of the demographic shift in China. So they might be enough new enterprising people within China where this is the case. But we've already seen, for example, the pushback and curtailing of the private education business in China. That really happened in 2019. China used to be the wild east for like foreign education, and used to pay really well too. It was one of those gigs that I used to be an expat teacher, and people fought to get into China, even though you had to deal with the Great Firewall. China paid well. That has been somewhat regulated and curtailed a bit since 2019. But also, there's pretty big demographic declines in China coming up very soon. So the Chinese system is still in its expansion phase, which I think is statistically true, but it has other structural problems coming up. But maybe there's still, despite that, enough expansion of people going to university in China that it won't be offset quite as much by the decline in population and the number of elderly and their die-off. Anyway, recently I was talking to a friend in Norway who noted that most young people want a trades education and to avoid university. What's interesting about that is that's in Norway, where the economic considerations of that we talk about in America, or maybe even the UK, aren't as pressing. So why are people turning against the university there, where it's not the kind of economic drag and student loans and whatnot that it is in the US and sometimes the UK? All right. Nor do you have this massive endowment system and all this in Norway. So I think it's interesting that these attitudes are paralleled in the Scandinavian countries, where some of the concerns financially just aren't there. So there's other things prompting this. And let's get into this. Back to Ian Welsh here. I've noticed when discussing this that most people are resistant to the idea that this isn't the first time it's happened. Although I find it kind of hilarious that they're not, but I've noticed that people basically do not have a cultural understanding of education at all before the 1950s, which is the establishment with the baby boomers of the modern education system we have now. A lot of our fields of study that we teach in high school were solidified in the 40s and 50s. Think about literature as an answer to German philology. Think about combining rhetoric and composition with literature. Think about which sciences and math we taught, although there were major math revisions to the curriculum even before, in the United States anyway, even before the quote Common Core. But in general, the curriculum that we have set and the standard current traditional curriculum was set in the 40s and 50s and became universalized in the 60s and 70s. So that's for secondary school. But even in post-secondary school, the largesse of the universities was set first by GGI Bill and then by Cold War expansion. They began retreating in funding in the 80s and 90s. And we saw a massive expansion in administration from the 80s forward, and a massive expansion in cost to the individual student. Anyway, so I'm going through this really fast, but this is something I study. I mean, this is my day job. So, and I study it intensely. So I have a lot to say on this. We have this weird idea that before the modern era, there weren't large post-secondary sectors, that degrees and credentials for schooling are something new. Yeah, they're totally not. The university is medieval. It's a medieval institution. The modern institution is weird because it's not truly a medieval institution. It's been neoliberalized and liberalized and bought into the liberal state. But elements of it, including its guild system that we call tenure, are old. They go back a long time. Just like our credentialing system seems to be based off of Chinese and maybe even Persian models. I mean, this is not new. This isn't even slightly true. Heck, if we had the data, I'm sure we'd find something similar in ancient Egypt for a very small part of population, but yes. And for sure, the massive university system of Buddhist India went through more than one cycle. This is also true until it collapsed. Nalanda University being the Nalanda, what we would call now a university. The Nalanda School for Buddhist monks being one of the prime examples, which fell apart for reasons we don't entirely know after the Islamic conquest in northern India. This before we even get to China, a civilization which was based on a credentialing system for something like 2 millennia. Yep. But neither is it new in the West. Schools produce standard culture and standardized people as far as that goes. See Jeff Smith's Disciplined Minds. Culture allows the creation of long-standing institutions, not just the universities themselves, but bureaucracies of various forms, including corporate bureaucracies. It's not an accident that companies demand degrees, especially for managers. Although the expansion of companies demanding degrees for jobs that in the mid-century and even as late as the 80s and early 90s didn't require degrees were actually mostly about an artificial barrier to market competition so that HR or managers could figure out who the hell to hire because there was just so many possible applicants and internal testing was expensive. So they basically outsourced that to public education, to the universities, which put that cost not on the business, but on the individual applying. So, for example, you could be an actuarial off of a high school degree until probably the 80s and 90s, and now it requires specialized training. You could work for insurances and even get an insurance license with just a high school degree, but companies increasingly started requiring more and more people to have bachelor's degrees, even though it wasn't required for the profession. And we saw this with managers too. And it's important to remember that while massive educational blocks are not new, Ian Welsh is absolutely right about that. In the United States, before the GI Bill, something like less than 5% of people had a education above the secondary level. Hell, I think it was not until the 60s and 70s that we reached, most people having a secondary level education. I think, for example, a lot of working class people left school at 8th or 9th grade until the 1960s and 70s. And you still see this in Latin America. For example, the reason why we secundaria is in Mexico is like 5th grade to 9th grade, and then you graduate, and then there's preparatoria if you want to go to college, usually at some cost to your family, where you go 10th, 11th, 12th grade. That's true in a lot of Latin America. Anyone familiar with the International Baccalaureate program will know that there's the early years program, the middle years program, which is massive and starts at 10th grade because it incorporates all these countries where high school education formally stops at 9th or 10th grade, but then there's this interim schooling that kicks in for people who want to go to college. The United States has not done that. We have pushed people through our 12-year system pretty much since the 1970s. And it was really being pushed as early as the 40s and 50s. But it's important to remember this entire setup of this kind of schooling for this long, and even laws that really discouraging dropping out, like the dropout rate was relatively high when I was in high school. That all is very new. Furthermore, this idea that 50% of students would apply and start college was really a thing that only really hit stride, I believe, in the 90s and aughts. Anyway, but the expansion of degrees with the GI Bill was actually the beginning of this trend that people often misattribute to neoliberalism. It actually begins in the 1940s and 50s, where due to the wealth share of the world's wealth in the United States, there was this idea that we would not need as many blue collar workers. That did not kick in and cause deindustrialization until the end of Fordism in the middle 70s, but nonetheless. This culture creation is used in political competition. Think the medieval church versus various kings, or kings versus their future lord, or the Confucian scholar officials versus hereditary nobility. In the modern world, consider what happens when university-trained, mostly Ivy League degree holders took over the media, which didn't happen, by the way, until the media started shrinking locally. So, Ivy League journalist is actually a relatively new phenomenon. I've actually done shows on it and interviews with it. You can go see an early interview I did on this channel all the way back 3 years ago with Joe Payne, when I talked about how there used to be, associate degree holder and high school and just high school educated journalist, and a lot of famous writers cut their teeth doing that. The shift to Ivy League degree holders in the media was actually a shift that happened in my lifetime, in my 20s. And it also happened as the local outlets declined. So pay went down, and the only people who could do the early work to become a major media official are people who could work for free and do a lot of internships, which required wealth to do. And we see this in a lot of things that require, like, to get in school and holistic things, you have to do a lot of activism a lot of times to be able to write the appropriate diversity statement or whatever with proper backing. And that requires you to have leisure time and resources, and also the social and cultural capital to be able to formulate that the right way. Anyway, are the effects of MBAs taking over from engineers and companies? Yeah, we've seen a big shift in MBAs, and we've even seen this in the tech industry. You can listen to Ed Citron talk about it in Silicon Valley. We've seen a ton of shifting of people who were at least partial engineers or coders or whatever, who worked their way up and maybe did it initially. Even someone like Zuckerberg started out kind of in this position, but moving over to MBAs who do not necessarily understand the products in which they are building. And so instead of hiring from within the engineering core and giving them management training, we started hiring professional managers whose primary skill is social. And the case of Jack of General Motors, there's a lot of businesses we can talk about where this happened, and you saw a shift from focus on product and competitive on products to playing stock games or juking numbers. And it was very profitable in returns to shareholders until it started emptying out the business. But that model has spread throughout industries in the United States. People will call this short termism. But it's a larger phenomenon. Boeing is a good example of the consequences, as is Google, as is like I said, General Motors, but so is the entire shipping industry out of the US and the enablement of China. I think that's kind of true. Education is one of the sinews of political conflict. Absolutely. That's why it's so politicized. Universities, our credential systems in general, go through 4 phases. All 4 phases don't always happen, but sometimes the cycle is stopped before it reaches its end. Expansion. Lots of new students pour in. This is what happened in the United States from the 1950s to the 1990s. But the massive expansion and the massive acceleration was the 1990s. And the peak was literally a couple years ago. More institutions are created. Formal requirements for professions are credentialized through institutions. In the medieval era, this was civil law, canon law, medicine, and theology. In the modern era, it includes much more. Particular of note are engineers, but also like all management, all kinds of white collar work that you could used to be able to do just by getting, a high school degree. All that stuff changed. During this period, having an agreement means an almost certain complete certainty of getting a job. That's true. Think of the 50s. A BA is all you needed to vault into management. This was when the idea of the PMC came up, and it really was a straight ticket to management if you got education. That's not true anymore, but it's weird that we resurrected the category. I'll come back to that because I think that is tied into this. Cultural production outstrips positions. Into the easy early period, you have to compete for positions. There aren't enough. It is harder today to get in some elite schools than it was 20 years ago when the benefit to that was more. Credential inflation starts. What once required a BA now requires an MA. The amount of time for higher degrees gets longer, and so on. We see this, for example, in the humanities, where it's particularly bad, where the average person in getting an English or history degree takes 8 years, in addition to already what they had to do in undergrad. Back in the early 1990s, a friend taking a PhD in psychology told me that a PhD alone was no longer enough. 10 years earlier, it had been. Yep. In my field, I have an MFA. When I was entering MFA, you could still get tenure track jobs with an MFA. Now you see people competing with MFAs and multiple books. I have an MFA in creative writing to get into PhD programs. So they've already well established their career. The price of getting an education increases. It definitely has and outstripped inflation until very recently. And in this and the third stage, it tends to skew more and more towards the wealthy. And we've seen that. What we've seen is a loss of economic diversity while other attempts to diversify universities have happened, but mostly at only the elite level. For example, most students of color who are not Asian um, are richer than their white counterparts in universities. Um, and quite a few of them are from foreign countries. We've seen this uh, pretty profoundly as universities have tried to diversify, but they haven't diversified by putting a bunch of working class black kids into the Ivy League. That isn't what's been happening, and yet the way we talk about things like affirmative action made it sound like it was. Economic diversity in higher education has decreased rapidly in the last decade. That's a fact. I could go into the stats, but I don't need to here. I've done it before. This, I note, has obviously happened in our society. Back in the 60s, education was practically free. Now it requires a student loan that we may not be able to pay off for decades or ever. A whole lot of people aren't going to ever be able to pay them off. All the positions are filled. We are here. This is not just a lot of competition, but the degrees are increasingly worthless unless you have clout from something other than education because the positions are filled. The number of people who live off the productive system but don't contribute to it goes up. And this is also expanded in that prior phase um, where, for example, these universities increasingly take more and more students to justify the positions that are already filled, even though they don't really need them, um, to get credentials, and their standards actually go down while the competition in them to get goes up. So it's harder to get in these programs, but the standards to graduate have probably lessened um, because they need people in them to maintain the current positions. But we'll see a lot of these things go away through attrition. We're seeing programs shut. We're seeing universities shut. That's going to continue to happen. And what's going to happen is power law. That what's going to make up the space is a mild increase in things like Ivy League universities growing, these massive endowments that they have, not from their student body and not even from donations. It's actually from the fact they use the donations to buy up massive rental holes and stock options and this, that, and the other. And so these endowments, even at public universities in the United States, are giant. And the other major source of revenue for these elite universities tends to be their hospital system. So they're actually benefiting from both our broken education system and our broken medical system at the same time. Now, that's not true in Europe as much. Schools in Germany don't have these endowments, and the endowments for schools in Britain are lower than the United States. But nonetheless, it's a reality. Growth of physicians to administrators and educate from 1970 to 2009. And by the way, this happened in education around the same time in the aughts, not just in higher ed, which people know about, but in even public ed, secondary. We saw the expansion of board level consulting positions actually around No Child Left Behind to meet those standards, and they stayed. And they're also actually there to fulfill the legal requirements and protect schools from lawsuits as this expands, but they're a bigger and bigger drain on the overall system. So, for example, educational results have actually declined since 2016. we started, I think actually the first test what we started seeing decline in literacy amongst 8th graders was 2015. You can't even blame it on Trump. It accelerated massively when it was redone, I think in 2021, 2022, down to declines in literacy down as low as 4th grade, which is a big deal. And in addition to that, the cost of educating a student in most places, this is on average and it's national, doubled from 2000 to 2020. But the teacher pay as a percentage of payouts declined. And for public schools, 93% or like 91 to 93% of their cost are staff. So if teachers are making less, who's making that money? And the answer is an increase in board level administration and some increase at site level administration. This is well documented, but it's not often discussed. And it's a major problem. And yes, there's other things costing money, like physical infrastructure, technological investments. The technology sector in education is a major rent seeker, like hard to even articulate how much of a major rent seeker it is, but it's all over the place. And this is just in secondary education. And post-secondary education in college, it's far worse, with far more admin and other uneducational costs like facilities, etc., going up through the roof, and they're not as limited in what they spend money on. All right, let's continue. This goes in phases. Right now, a BA gets you nothing but a chance to apply and be rejected, and BA enlistment is falling, but STEM still offers a decent chance, depending on the STEM. Depending on the STEMs, there are many STEM fields that have not been doing well for a decade. Biology, for example. This won't remain true in the West for much longer. I think that's true, actually. I think there's very few STEM jobs that automatically put you in good stead anymore, except coding, and that's being hit by AI. While AI is a lot less of a useful product than we've been sold, it's actually pretty good at helping you code. And while it creates dependency on Silicon Valley in a way that's kind of pernicious, it does decrease the need for coders. And the code it writes isn't always good, and it's definitely not elegant, but nonetheless. During this period, alternate cultural production gets fired up. Intellectuals who can't get positions produce books, pamphlets, blogs, podcasts, and so on. We saw this massively from the aughts and the aught teens. I mean, there's just tons of academics going into alt media. Think about the number of alt media figures who have Ivy League degrees. I'll mention one of them, Brianna Joy Gray, but there's a ton of them. I mean, people who will, talk working class because of their historical background, but they worked at NYU and they're on Left podcast. They attack academia and seek forms of legitimacy other than credentials, although they have credentials. I mean, I'm an example of this. I'm highly credentialed, even though I'm blue collar and I grew up poor. And I'm a high school teacher now. I'm actually way more qualified than a lot of my colleagues. And I don't say that to dismiss my colleagues. They didn't need it. They're good at their job. My point here is that a lot of people get burned in this program and end up in para-academic and situations. We saw the expansion of blogs, etc. And even people who were trained to clearly go in traditional media degrees have now ended up doing all kinds of supplementary stuff. And we see this with Substack too. And so this is what Peter Turchin calls the overproduction of elites. It's not the first time this has happened. Finally, collapse. The state stops enforcing monopolies. That's going to happen because of lack of enrollment. University enrollments drops and many institutions fail entirely. We're already seeing this in the closure of mid and small liberal arts schools all over the country. Other forms of cultural production become dominant, etc. So I think that's all true. Let's get into the medieval university crisis. And I actually know something about this, so we'll get into it. The medieval university cycle. The rise really gets going in the 1100s, though some institutions are created earlier. By the 1200s, they are credited by the Church of the Holy Roman Emperor. just makes credentials valid throughout Christendom, and no other higher credentials are. At this time, both the papacy and various kings and principalities are expanding their administration, and there are tons of positions. I mean, even nobility needs a lot of scribes. Nobles weren't necessarily literate, and they would often hire people from what was effectively the beginnings of the burgher classes, who went through this education system, are priests, second sons of nobility, etc., to do these positions. And that required a massive expansion of educational capacity. And it really kind of begins in the 9th century, in the quote dark ages unquote, but it really expands in the 12th. I mean, in the 11th century, excuse me, in the 1200s. As with the Confucian scholars in the early days, these administrators are used to expand central authority. Feudalism begins to decline. It's the beginning of modern nation states, which really consolidates 200 years from now. But here you go. In addition, the monopoly of law, medicine, and theology worked against feudal nobles, and that's why the central power wanted to establish it. They wanted to weaken the feudal nobles. Every major pope from 1159 to 1303 held a degree in law from a university. I didn't know that. Other signs of the end of the reign of the medieval scholastics is when other ways of training came to the fore. In England, it was the 1400s, for example. Lawyers no longer learn in Oxbridge, but in London, for example, no longer learn in Oxbridge, but in London, in what amounts to an apprenticeship system. So you see, by the 1500s, Oxbridge no longer teaches physicians. This moves to the Royal College of Physicians, and soon after, the monopoly of clergy on medicine is ended. The height of the system is significant. 2,000 to 4,000 students were enrolled at Oxford and Cambridge, for example. This is 4 times as many proportionally as were enrolled in Elizabethan England. And as a proportion of the population, the medieval height wasn't surpassed until the 1900s. And it's interesting to think about this. This is before the calamitous 14th century, the 1300s. But we also think of Elizabethan England as a massive expansion education, science, because of imperialism, and that's actually somewhat true. But it was in a declining moment of education. Shakespeare and all this comes out of this. A lot of people later on think that a lot of the conspiracies about Shakespeare, for example, are based on the belief that a lot of people were educated and Shakespeare couldn't have been, so he couldn't have done what he was doing. But grammar school education was still largely and reading, writing, and arithmetic was still kind of based off of ancient Padilla, but it was just in a weakened time period of education. At this height, at least 5% of the male population attended universities, and it could have been as high as 10%. Now, I want you to remember, in the 1990s, we were getting to 50% of the population was attempting university. 40% have degrees. Today, people under 40 or 45, 60% have some higher education, 40% have degrees. By the way, I just want to put that in perspective. The entire industrial sector employment in the United States is 15% of the population. Just sit with that for a second. All right. The medieval system, note, goes into decline 50 years before the Black Death. So it wasn't caused by declining populations. It was not. And that's a common misconception. The Black Death puts a nail in the coffin, but it started way before that. As the medieval system goes into decline, the humanists rise. That's the beginning of people like Erasmus and these informal Renaissance thinkers. So I know we don't think of the Renaissance as a moment of a decline in education because more people were getting educated, but it was a decline in the university system. So one of the things this tells you is general education and universities aren't always as strongly correlated as we think. They work outside of the universities, often as publishers or authors, and rely on noble patronage. Literally, like I do today, I rely on your patronage, diffuse patronage. They mock old academics as rigid, fussy, and out of date. But the decline isn't good for ordinary people, and this is something we miss. As mentioned in our own case, education becomes less and less available unless you have money and stops being a major way for people to rise. This is very much true in the medieval university decline. At the beginning, many poor individuals could attend, but as time went on, it became much less true. Signposts decline, and we're seeing many of them today. Smaller institutions start folding. The closure of many small liberal arts colleges in our time, for example, this is also true for religious colleges, etc. A fall in the number of students, that started happening 2 years ago. A decline in a number of institutions, we're beginning to see that. A loss of monopolies over credentials. I think we're going to see a lot of things that only recently added the need for credentials to get jobs start to remove them because of declining populations. I think that's almost inevitable. I'm already seeing, for example, the standards for like insurance companies. I used to work on them, so I follow them. Drop things that they started requiring degrees for in the 90s. They're beginning to drop those degrees away now. There's just not enough people, and there's not enough people who want to get education. Widespread attacks on what is taught and how it is taught. We see this across the board at all levels of education now. The great Gramscian, which is a misunderstanding of Gramsci, but conservatives use Gramsci and are not close readers of him if they're readers at all. It's probably kind of the predecessor to meme politics. We see a great deal of this now, and it has progressed to politicians passing laws. Yep. Some of which we'll regret later, but that's never stopped following stupid shit like that in the past, particularly in democracies, which medieval societies largely weren't. All right. Increase in the cost of education with poorer students being cut out. We've been seeing that for 30 years. Cheap degrees, which were mere formalities, degree mills and so on. We saw that too, and that's also beginning to decline because they're not really helpful anymore. Note that the phases 3 and 4 can feed in political instability. This is what Peter Turchison says. Peter Turchison kind of says this leads to popular collapse. Funny. Ian Welsh is going to talk about that. In recent years, Peter Turchison has popularized this, and many think he created the idea, but it's been long discussed as an important in revolutions such as the French and Russian ones. People who are highly educated but didn't get positions they wanted are vastly destabilizing. Actually, even the Marxist turned post-Trotskyist turned both founder of paleo and neoconservatives in some ways. James Burnham saw this in the perpetuation of managers in the 20th century, and also saw that as leading to revolutions. But the Italian elite school talked about this a lot. It's not a new idea. Peter systematized it through coming up with something like economic laws, but nonetheless, he's not the first person to think about it. Clear dynamics is interesting. I can go into my critiques of parts of it. It tends to use methodological nationalist data. It doesn't tend to look at world systems, and it simplifies things to declare broad laws. But there's some truth to what he's basically talking about. They feel betrayed and have tools to fight ideologically and often understanding of how to administrate movements and organizations. Although the problem with this is that also elites in these institutions tend to decay as they become more and more tied to wealth. The cost of getting educated also means that there's just less competent people getting educated, and it's a smaller and smaller, more nepotistic pool. So elites get shallower and shallower. So they just can't do what their predecessors could do because they're not pulling from enough parts of the population to get fresh people. This makes social hierarchies more rigid, but also makes the rigidity of social hierarchies produce stupider elites. I don't really know how else to put it. Raise your expectations, trade them, then let them rot in poverty, and you'll make yourself a potential enemy. The cycles are dead common. Colin identifies a number in the West. The medieval cycle starts in the 1100s, peaks in the 1200s, over most places by the 1400s, which begins the Renaissance, by the way. This sets up the English cycle from 1500 to 1860. That interesting corresponds with the beginnings of capitalism and liberalism. We see this in Spain, France, and Germany all around the same time. In the U.S., from 1700 to 1880. The various national ones, though they start about the same time, other than in America, are separate and have different patterns of rise and decline. Now, all of them go all the way. The American universities have never gone through phase 4, for example, but we're not an old society. Education systems rise and fall like all else in human society. What is happening now in our system is very similar to what happened before. And if we want to understand it, what will happen to our system, the best way to know is to see what happened before. It will never be a one-to-one match. The details will differ, but the broad patterns hold. The obvious thing to do now for those who want to slow the fall and end it before it collapses to figure out what sort of training they can produce, which isn't an oversupply. But we don't know right now because the economy itself is changing so fast. And that is a difference from prior times. For individuals, the question is where the new forms of cultural production is and how to legitimize it and reap the benefits of that legitimization. One might wonder if the rise of podcasting intellectuals who use their celebrity to sell books is a fad or a sign of something greater. I may return to that in the future. In the meantime, it's all happened before. I don't think it's a fad. Some of those, I saw a round of this in Zero Books. I actually talked about this before, where bloggers who were highly educated humanities people didn't have jobs or they couldn't get decent enough jobs. They were adjuncts or whatever for longer than they should be. And they started doing cultural outreach on blogs. And it led to things like Mark Fisher and K-Punk and a lot of the early authors at Zero Books under the Fisher and Goddard, or even the early part of the Douglas Lane phase. When I was first there, we were getting a lot of people who were academics who fell out of it. A lot of podcasters today are well-trained academics up to PhD level, often with credential degrees. You'll see me sit on shows with people who have Ivy League degrees. Sometimes I can dance around them. I'm going to give myself credit for that. But a lot of times, it's just because their prospects are quite different than they used to be. We see this also in the level of hazing and high-level academic training and just making it difficult for difficult sake. That's what happens when these cultures stultify, become more elite, become more walled off, etc. So I think Peter Turchin has a point, but I think there's another point to deduce from this, which is that educational elites are also coming from richer strata, and they are highly competitive, but money is part of how they get around it. And so it's harder and harder for people domestically to even attempt to compete with them. So why try? We're going to see a flood of people into the trades, but the thing is, the organic composition of the needs for a lot of these trades are just not there, and a lot of the services are care work and are not traditionally high paid, and as they become high paid, are going to be a pressure on social costs. Think about the incredible increase in the cost of childcare, which now costs more than universities in many cases. Over the past 10 years. It's actually led to a minor decline in both men and women in the workforce. Now, there are other reasons for men not being in the workforce, some of which are sociological and quite bleak, but stay-at-home dads, because of the expense of childcare and because certain care jobs are traditionally more female, has been part of it. We also saw a fairly large decrease in women working in the past decade as well, particularly after COVID. And that's also probably pushing a lot of why people want to work from home. And people who instituted attempts to get workers to come back in, we're often trying to get them to quit. So it's a lot to take in, but the university cycle is part of it. But I do think Ian Welsh needs to factor in capitalism and all of this and how capitalism has complicated this scenario. I think these larger historical patterns are absolutely true, but remember, we're talking about rise and decline patterns of like 5 to 10% of the population. 40% of the population in the United States has at least a BA. Think about that. And as people don't go into that, but also the needs of factories just don't have the same employment needs. They've been automated. And automation, I wonder what we see what's going to happen. Now, you've heard over and over again that automation has never led to, or technology has never led to a mass decline in jobs. Those stats are based solely on the 20th century most of the time. Maybe they go into the 19th century, but they don't go further back than that. Yeah. Start thinking about what you hear. All right. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, and learn about stuff wherever you can. The credentialing system is going to get hit.